This is going to be a video on ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is one of the synoptic elements that you need for Unit 4. So you need to be able to talk about things from AS, A2, and just other information from general knowledge, which is what I'm going to try and give you some of here, and you're going to be able to do some research. All of it can be made relevant. Remember, throughout this, you should be making some notes. Yeah, these notes are going to be vitally important when it comes to revision and things like that, and using in class when we're going to look at it deeper and talk about your understanding and do some exam questions and things. So by the end of this 15-minute video or so, you're going to be able to describe what ethnocentrism is, be able to define various keywords like an ethic, an emic, a collectivist, and an individualistic culture. And then you're going to have some extended research and a couple more videos to watch, all of which should give you a good basis of understanding of what ethnocentrism is. So in the first year, we will have talked about ethnocentrism, and you'll have used it as the offshoot of generalizability. Basically, that a study done in a certain culture or a certain group of people wouldn't be able to be generalized to another group. But ethnocentrism goes much deeper than that. It's its own field of study. So what we need to think about is psychology being ethnocentric as a whole. So when we look at some of the statistics around psychology, we can see that it is massively skewed towards European people. So 64% of the world's researchers in psychology are American. 94% in American in textbooks come from America. 1% in Europe. 2% in Europe. Australasian is about 3%, and really you can't apply it to lots of the places around the world. So all psychology, if it's done on white, middle-class American people, usually students, we question how much it can actually be applied to other cultures. So if we took the Milgram study and plonked it down in the middle of a tribe in Papua New Guinea or Africa, we'd question how much they would actually follow the rules or the ideas of obedience. Especially when we look at different ideas, so a scientist would mean nothing to them. He wouldn't have an authority as he does in the Western world. So we'd question whether they would have a similar sort of obedience effect. And also their concepts possibly of what it is to be a good citizen might be different. So what is a culture? These are some definitions of culture. So a relatively organized system of shared meanings, collective programming of the mind which distinguishes members of one group from another. That's by Hofstede. Hofstede is going to be a big part of this particular presentation because he comes up with the ideas of collectivist and individualistic cultures. Or we could say it's a set of attitudes, values, beliefs and behaviours shared by a group of people, but different for each individual, communicated from one generation to the next. Basically, a culture is a shared identity or a shared set of characteristics and behaviour from one location. So this can include all of these things: your race, your ethnicity, remember they are separate things, your belief in kind of the economy and work life, what it should be like, family life, religion, certain rites of passage. So we obviously have in the UK the idea that you get to 18 and you're allowed to drink. In America there's more a focus on kind of sweet 16 parties. In Latin America they have big parties when teenage girls turn 15. In Jewish culture there's bar mitzvahs at 13. In some tribes, and I do apologise, I forgot how this one particularly is, but what they do is they stick their hands and other body parts into specially built pouches full of biting fire ants. And the entire principle is you become an adult by showing that you can survive this pain. So ethnocentrism, again, it's not just about generalizability of a study, it is the tendency to view the world from your own culture. Yet use your own culture as a yardstick for what everyone else should be like. So you think that because your culture is like that, your culture is correct, and all the other ones that vary are either wrong or unusual. So you often overestimate the importance of what you find about your own culture. And this is going to be a big problem, as I say, when the vast majority of studies are done in a westernized white culture, because it doesn't apply to, let's face it, the majority of the world. So as I said, it's using one's own culture as a benchmark, and what we might end up doing is ignoring the views, the beliefs, and real scientific evidence from other cultures because it doesn't fit with our way of thinking. So research which is centered around one culture is called ethnocentric. All of this is just different ways of talking about what ethnocentrism is. Have some notes on it, and we can expand on this in class. So, for example, we have what we call an emic construct and an etic construct. So an etic construct is a universal trait. This is something that is found across all cultures. So family. Yeah, every single culture around the world has the concept of family. Every single culture around the world at some point or another has had the concept of religion. Or we have the concept of gender. But emic constructs are things which are individual to certain cultures. So monogamy in Western culture. We believe that usually or traditionally one man, one woman, or indeed nowadays one man, one man, one woman, one woman. Whereas other cultures, and more creeping into our own culture, admittedly, they go in for polygamy. Yeah, where there is one man and two wives, or three wives, or vice versa, where there's one woman and several husbands. And what we have to be careful to do is not confuse our etics with emics. Yeah? So we may think that the natural or the normal way is one man, one woman, or one man, one woman, things like that. When really there's nothing theoretically wrong with having multiple partners at the same time. Evolutionary speaking, it does seem that our bodies or our sexual behaviors are designed for having polygynous relationships. Another classic example of this is gender. So gender varies around the world. I'll stick to gender examples because we've done that in first year. So we've got the ideas of what masculinity and femininity are. But those are just emic constructs. Yeah, around the world this varies. So we've talked about briefly the studies of Mead, where she looked at different tribes around the world and found that their gender was different, their ideas of masculinity and femininity. And it goes even further than that. There's the Khazi people of India. I'll include links to these couple of things that I'm talking about below this, so you can do some further reading on them, and we can use them in examples throughout the year. So, sorry, the Khazi people of India live in a matrilineal society, or matriarchal society. Wealth and power is passed through the females of the society. So the youngest daughter of a family inherits all of the wealth, whether she's got older brothers and sisters, younger brothers, whatever it is. The youngest girl is the one that gets the power, which is the opposite of what we've always found in Western society, where it's often the oldest boy. This goes even as far as when a man marries a woman in the Khazi society, he takes her surname and moves in with her family. What we find is this obviously changes what we think, obviously, in masculine and feminine. They did a study where they compared the Khazi women of India to the Maasai of Africa, which are a very strong masculine society, to the point that in the Maasai, women are property. You can buy a woman for about 10 cows. She's the property of her husband. So what they did was compare these for competitiveness. And they found out whichever is the dominant sex in that society is much more likely to be competitive. So the women in the Khazi were more likely to gamble than the men, and vice versa in the Maasai. So the ideas of competitiveness and aggression and things may go with women in a different society. This is compared to other things as well in Afghanistan. If a family doesn't have a son, what they'll do is they'll have one of their daughters raised as a boy. So she'll be male up until puberty. This is called the boyish push. And what happens again then at puberty is she's expected to transition into a female role. And they often find this very difficult because they've not been raised as a female, and suddenly to go to a situation where they have much less power, they're not fans of it, obviously. In Samoa and other cultures such as that, they have a concept of the Fa'afafine. And the Fa'afafine are a third gender. They are usually males. who have identified themselves not as female, because the Samoan Islanders allow for 3 genders, but as Fa'afafine, yeah, which is a more kind of feministic sort of character as of what we would assume. What's interesting is that that changes kind of the sexuality dynamics in the groups. They are totally accepting of it in the Samoa. In fact, some families push it on to children. There's been lots of complaints from some boys that they were forced into this role when really they felt masculine. And what we see in the Fa'afafine is they are kind of, it shouldn't be confused with bisexual and homosexuality and things, but they are likely to have relationships with either straight males of the Samoans or straight females. Yeah, because they are seen as a third gender, something totally separate. So, moving on from that, this is Gut Hofstede. Hofstede came up with various dimensions of how we could look at a society. So we've got the power distance index. So that's seeing how much power the individual expects to have and how much power they expect their government or their rulers to have. And we can be in either high or low in any of these characteristics. Masculinity and femininity, with a masculine being a strongly competitive and dominant society, whereas a feminine society is thought to be very caring and left-wing almost. There's long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, whether they are focused on a very hedonistic lifestyle in short term, or are more focused on the future generations and things like that. In Japan and China and things, they often talk about lifelong goals or future ideas of not how will this affect me, but how will this affect my grandchildren. And the real one that we need to focus on and talk about is the concept of individualism versus collectivism, or an individualistic culture and a collectivist culture. So an individualistic culture emphasizes self-interest, one's interest in immediate family, and personal autonomy or independence, initiative, achievement. So really the society is focused on individuals being the best person they can be. We are one of these. America is even more so, an individualistic culture, where people are seen as getting ahead because they are intelligent, they have worked hard, they have skills, they have been willing to kind of cut other people aside and work for it more than others. Whereas there's a collectivist culture which emphasizes loyalty to the group, interdependence, the belief that the group's decisions are more important than individual ones. So we see this a lot in China and Japan, in Asian countries like that, which focus on the importance of the family. And the idea that you have shamed your family is kind of one of the worst things that can happen. This is why often you'll find in these sort of cultures, they will give their surname before they give their first name, because the family is the more important thing. Family is also an interesting concept if we look at things like Japan. Companies like Toyota are a family firm. Couldn't say that, but I was doing inverted commas. They're a family firm in the way that they have been kept inside the Toyota family. But if you were the lead director of the Toyota family and you didn't think that your child, your son or your daughter was the right person to lead the company, what you do is you actually adopt one of your workers. Yeah? You find who you want for the job and you adopt them into your family. And you then become their actual family. Which is again something completely different from what we expect. Because their focus is on the collective, doing well in the collective. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. So I'll come back to this. Oh, sorry, this is exactly it. So Kuyoshi, Yang, and Bond carried out personality tests in Taiwan, another collectivist culture, and in a Western culture. And what they did was they basically asked people to rate their friends on various personality characteristics. And they compared these to what people from another culture had also rated as the best characteristics. So what we see is that when we look at westernized characteristics and westernized people, they say that their friends, their people that they obviously really like and care about, their qualities are being extroverted, emotional stability, conscientiousness, very kind of individualistic sort of characteristics. Whereas if we look at the Chinese traits that we ask people to rate them on, They talk about social orientation, expressiveness, competence, self-control, and optimism. All very kind of group-based characteristics. This is further true when we look at a study where they looked at attractiveness. They showed people in Western and Eastern cultures an attractive person and asked them to identify which characteristics they would have. In the Western people, they said that they were likely to be extroverted, outgoing, friendly, intelligent, whereas in the Eastern culture, which is, remember, collectivist, they talked more about being able to get on with people, being socially orientated, not being too forthcoming or too forward, because that could put people off. So what they classified as being good qualities depended on whether they were individualistic or collectivist. So these are two other examples of kind of studies in relationships. Salomon looked at people in Japan and West Germany. Japanese friends are much closer than you would expect or than you see in other cultures. They have a concept known as the Shinyin friendship. And the Shinyin friendship is basically a friend who knows every single thing about you. You can talk about absolutely anything with them. Whereas in Germany, people were a lot more kind of closed off. Shaver Schwartz looked at romantic love in China and in westernized countries. And the idea that marriage should be based solely on romantic love, the Chinese people thought this was unrealistically optimistic, that just pure romance leads to pain and misery. A very classic study, and again I'll put a link down the bottom so you can read a bit more about this, when we talk about ethnocentrism, is the Yerkes IQ test. So they developed an IQ test for people when they came to America, ready to join the army, and they thought that it measured IQ. However, when they've looked at it again through kind of better eyes years later, they've realized that it wasn't testing this at all. You had to come from a European and American culture to get a high score. So lots of people from Africa, people from Western Europe, places like that could not have scored above very low IQ. So if we just look at the results, for example, they suggested that black men had a score of 10.4, which was much lower than white people. By white, what they actually meant was white Americans. So some of the questions they asked you were filling in things like this. Identify what's missing. The problem if you look at the second row is if you come from a country or a culture that doesn't have houses like that, how are you meant to know that there's not a chimney there? If you come from cultures where there's not a lot of kind of electric lights and things, you wouldn't know that the filament of a light bulb was missing. The second row from the bottom, if you don't come from a culture that plays a lot of tennis or bowling, then you're not going to notice things are missing. The same with the card in the bottom right-hand corner. Yet it relied on you and classed intelligence as understanding Western culture. When if you're not from that culture, that's a bit unfair. So this is the end of this little video. So by now you should hopefully have a bit of a better understanding of ethnocentrism and what it means to be ethnocentric, using your culture as kind of the guide for what all other cultures should be. You should have a concept of what an emic and an etic construct are. And you should be able to use some examples from the real world, especially about gender, as well as having an idea of what an individualistic and a collectivist culture are at a bare minimum. So I'm going to include some more reading and a few more links in the bottom that you can have a look at, as well as the tasks about like researching things, making notes, etc. that I want to see in lesson when we come into it. So once again, thanks for listening.